Recently, it seems that our Western culture is grappling like never before with how to deal with issues of otherness. What does it mean to be diverse from one another? What does it mean to celebrate difference? And what does it mean to find pathways back towards one another through reconciliation instead of heading in our opposite directions because of our differences? The key to making all of that happen is having your eyes opened to who you are and who others are, and leaning in with compassion to hear the stories of those who are other from us. Today's guest has done precisely that and is doing precisely that as he explores and begins to identify in new ways with what it means to be Cuban American. Welcome to this episode of The Transformationist. Are you thirsty for inspiration and curious about the life-changing process of transformation? Welcome to The Transformationist. Whether you already know the transformation you're looking for or you're looking for guidance on the way there, these stories of hope will give you practical tips, plenty of encouragement, and an invitation into real, life-giving transformation, whether you're transforming culture or becoming more yourself. Your story is welcome here. On today's episode of The Transformationist, a delight to sit down with a good friend of mine, Joel Diaz, from the Atlanta area in Georgia. Keeping it 100, that's been what I've learned in my little sojourn here in Atlanta. I'm still not sure if I'm saying it exactly right, but there you go. Welcoming Joel onto the podcast today to talk about something that is fascinating to me as somebody who spends a lot of time traveling in and out of other cultures, talking primarily about what does it mean to discover your ethnic heritage, your racial blueprint, if it were, and then figure out how to navigate around that in the world you live in, no matter where that may be. So a delight to have you joining us on the show, Joel. Thanks for coming along.
Super excited.
So tell us a little bit about your background and where you come from, because sort of the starting point of this conversation is that you are the son of immigrants to the United States.
Yeah.
So where did they come from? Tell us a bit about your parents and your family.
So both of my parents came to the United States from Cuba, so 90 miles south of Key West in Florida. They came as teenagers, eventually reconnecting here in Atlanta at a youth event at a local church, fell in love with each other and eventually got married. And then that's how I showed up on the scene here in Atlanta.
So why did your parents leave Cuba?
Because of the revolution. I mean, there was a lot of pressure there. Things became very uncomfortable. And so my dad was able to leave with his parents on what's called the Freedom Flights, which occurred during the late 60s, early 70s. And then my mom left with her parents, and they actually first went to Spain then eventually ended up here in the Atlanta area. Long story there. But my grandfather was very valuable to the government, being in the medical field. He basically was kind of like the CDC for the island. So if something broke out, some type of illness, something was going on in the city, my grandfather with a team of doctors and lab technicians would go there, try to isolate whatever was the problem, and then make sure that they eradicated it and then treated the people. And that was it. So it was very difficult. And his circumstances of getting out was pretty much, I know not everybody believes in miracles, but it was an incredible set of circumstances that occurred where the government let my grandfather not only leave with my grandmother, but also my mom, to give them all three permission to leave, knowing we give this guy permission to leave with his entire family. He's not coming back. And that's how they were able to get out.
Okay. So growing up, what kind of, what did it look like? What did it feel like to be Cuban for you growing up in the United States?
It was all I knew until I entered the school system at 5 years old. So everything at home was in Spanish, super tight-knit family. My grandparents were around when I was a newborn, and my brother was a newborn. We did our obligatory stint as good Cubans in Miami for 1 year of my childhood because of my dad's work.
Right.
But church was in Spanish. I mean, just everything for the majority early on in life, everything that I can remember was Spanish. So technically English is my second language.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you started to learn English when you went to school?
Yeah. I mean, I'd start, in the playground, my mom told me a story. At this point in my life, we lived in Omaha, Nebraska for 1 year because of my dad's work. Mm-hmm. And she's told me stories of my kind of eavesdropping in on my brother and I with our neighborhood friends in our Omaha neighborhood where we're speaking to our friends in Spanish and they're replying in English. Mm. And somehow we learned to communicate that way. And so our little friends were learning Spanish words and we were learning English words. And that's where that started. And then I went started to go into school there. At that point, we were at an English-speaking church because we had left the Atlanta area and gone to the Midwest. So everything was kind of in English, and that's kind of where the transition for our family. My dad, he was in the business world, so he had to learn English. My mom, even at that point, was not comfortable in a full-on English conversation, even though she graduated from an American high school in Atlanta. So that's really where I remember that transition, starting to learn English and English becoming more heard within, you could hear it in our house every once in a while.
Okay. How long did that transition? I mean, when you get together with your family now, do you speak primarily in Spanish or is English the language of the day?
Depends on the person.
Oh,
right?
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, because my dad's been in the business world and I actually spent, early on in my adulthood years working with my dad in the business world, it was weird because we would have anything that was business related is English.
Yes.
And then when we talk about family stuff, it'll be Spanish. With my mom, typically it's in Spanish. Phone conversations in Spanish. If we have an English speaker around and we're at the house, obviously English, to be polite. Grandparents, always Spanish.
Right.
Aunts, uncles, everything's in Spanish. So it just depends on the family member. And if you track it back, the longer that I've known them, the more likely it is that I speak Spanish with them.
Right.
Versus New York family members, we automatically just speak in English.
Mm-hmm. So what's the role that language plays then? So in the culture I come from, language has been a really important part, almost the most critical part of keeping what we call Te Ao Māori or Te Reo Māori. So the Māori worldview and then the language of Māori alive and in the present day. What is the role of language? Because, I mean, Spanish is the language of Cuba, but it's not necessarily Spanish is a language that belongs to lots of parts of the world.
Right.
So what's the relationship between speaking the language and then owning and embracing Cuban culture at home? Did you keep hold of Cuban culture as you were growing up, or did your family sort of slowly start to migrate more fully into a traditional American existence?
Ooh, I think it's both. Like, American traditions set in, but they were, what's a good word? They were enhanced by Cuban culture, in my opinion, right? I love American culture. I'm not trying to knock it, but there's and basically when I say enhancements, it's more food. All right. So me, big into, I love food. I love exploring different cultures and what they eat and flavors, but there'd be a mix. Like if you came to a Thanksgiving dinner when I was a kid, like there would be a turkey, but more than likely there's going to be black beans and white rice and some fried plantains along the way. And we'd be speaking Spanish at the table. Like all our family would come together. Everything would be in Spanish. The desserts, you might have a pumpkin pie and a pecan pie being down here in the South, but there's probably going to be tres leches and dulce de naranja. It's just like it's going to be like this mashup. And so there were things like that, but then there are things that, I don't know. It's hard to explain because it's so natural to me that it's almost like it's hard to find that division point between what is the American influence and what's the Cuban influence, because they've kind of just melded together so beautifully in my family. And so we still did like the big Cuban feast nights. Those still happen within my family. We still try to do that. And when I was growing up, they definitely happened. And that was kind of the big night where we got to share Cuban culture with American friends. So I remember sometimes our house just being packed full of people for the, pernil, which is like the roasted Cuban style ham, and the yuca and the plantains and the beans and the rice and all the desserts and everything that comes in Cuban cuisine was on the table. There was no American food per se there. And there's Cuban music playing and there's espresso. And at that point in my life, my parents were teetotalers, but now if you come, there's Cuban rum, there's Cuban cocktails, so it's just more of the Cuban culture. We play dominoes. I don't. It's a little too intense for me. But my dad and my brother, they get into it. And if you've ever been around Cubans playing dominoes, you really can't hear anything else. It's like one of the most intense table games I've ever witnessed. And so, but that's all going on. So that's always fun. And then, school friends would come over and they would just soak it up and they think it was awesome. All these new flavors and dominoes and the Spanish. And in fact, we had one friend in high school who just fell in love with the Spanish language and decided to spend, even though he lived here in Atlanta, he lived with us for a summer just to immerse himself. And the deal was, when we were at home, all we did was speak Spanish around our friend Gabe. And even to this day, he's completely conversational Spanish. He's got complete control of it.
Which is remarkable.
Yeah.
I mean, because Spanish is it's the second largest, or it's actually the most commonly spoken
I think it's spoken
language.
in the most countries. I think just by pure population, there are more Chinese speakers or Chinese language speakers.
But even here in the US.
Oh, in the
it?
US, yeah. I mean,
it's
everywhere you go.
Yeah, which is amazing. I mean, where I spend most of my time in California, I'm kind of wishing that I had learned Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
As opposed to German, which has been really helpful to me.
Yeah. I mean, there's pockets here in Atlanta where if you go, it'd be really good to know some Spanish. Just so you can read the signs.
Right.
And know what you're looking at. But
so how much time have you spent going back to Cuba?
So that's been recent.
Right.
I'm 44 now. My first trip was when I was 43. So just a little bit over a year and a half ago.
Oh, wow.
I'm about to go back at the end of this week, and I'll be there for 2 weeks. And it's a big trip because my wife and kids are coming with me on this one. But it was just about two years ago. Now we're coming
and why
up on
so
it.
long? I mean, is it obviously the Cuban-US relationship is something of a little bit of kind of common mythology
Yes.
in the world that I come from. Like, we understand some of the socio-political impacts of what happened with the revolution and the change of power there, and then the various trade embargoes that make that a really interesting political relationship with a country that, as you say, is just 90 miles south of Florida. It's kind of ludicrous. But what are the things that kept you? What are the things that kept you from going to Cuba or going home to Cuba and experiencing that culture?
I mean, there was definitely when you're part of a Cuban family, and especially one that suffered firsthand during the revolution. I mean, what happened was real within my family,
and so close in terms of generations, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, we're talking about my mom.
Yeah.
So one of the things of the revolution, good or bad, was that there was religious persecution. And so that's where my mom's side of the family suffered. My grandfather, even though being a medical doctor, was very involved in his Christian community there, was a leader. And while being a doctor full-time for the government, was also involved in ministry almost full-time. And so when the revolution occurred, they kind of started putting their thumbprints on different things and limiting things and eliminating things. And so there's that. And and having family members that were in Cuba that were arrested and spent time in prison. Some of them were tortured, and then having friends of the family that were tortured. So there's a lot of, you grow up hearing all of that, plus the political tensions between the U.S. and Cuba, which you've already alluded to. But it kind of, being where I'm at now, it became something of a whipping post. Cuba did for the U.S.
Right.
Whereas like, this is our common enemy. And Cubans that were coming into South Florida in droves, they were also battered people, tortured people, families split because of the revolution. I mean, a lot of division. And I think, if you could go back in time and in American history and look at the Civil War and seeing families that had to pick sides, I think that's what's happened here. Is the revolution came in and families picked sides. And even within my family, I have an uncle who recently passed away here in the States. But for years, he aligned himself with the communist government in Cuba and with the revolution and was all for it. It wasn't until decades later we were able to finally meet my uncle in Spain and meet in Madrid. And then that started the process. And they were lucky enough to win one of the very few U.S. immigration lottery drawings, which allowed them to come to the U.S. fully legal. And they lived with my parents for a while and were able to establish their lives here and made a great run of it until he passed away. My aunt's still living, but even that, I mean, that took some time because I grew up as a kid hearing about this uncle who was a communist. Right. And so that's the tension that's the reality in Cuban families and people my age in their 40s that are first generation American. Is you live in the midst of that tension between the revolution, which is still fresh on the minds of your parents and your grandparents, and then you're this American kid who I see that, but I also see hope for the future and trying to bring those two worlds together.
Right. So when your family came, I mean, obviously your parents were teenagers, but did they experience kind of backlash or racism, or I mean, what kind of experience did you have as a family unit, I guess, as that family was forming, of being immigrants into the US? In thinking about recording this podcast, my parents never really talked about that, but I know it existed. And I know it existed because I witnessed it in grade school, middle school, high school years. What was that experience like?
So my parents still have an accent. I remember one time in church, another church member basically telling my mom that she needed to learn how to speak English better. There was always comments like that. I remember one time a lady, my mom, we got stuck in the snow. We lived in Utah for a little while because of my dad's work. And so we got stuck in the snow in her car and the car wouldn't go. And my mom was trying to go and it just wouldn't go. And this lady came up and like banged on my mom's window that was behind us. And she was frustrated because she was stuck behind my mom and said something to her. And my mom tried to apologize. And when she heard my mom's accent, like just got nasty.
Right.
With my mom, and I'm, sitting there witnessing that. That sticks out in my mind a lot because my grandparents, I was sitting between them in the back seat, and I just got so angry that, as a kid, you don't know what you're saying, but I was like, if she comes back, I'm going to kill her. Like I said that. And my grandmother, my grandparents who are missionaries, like freaked out. Like, why'd you say that?
Yeah.
But I just remember how angry I was at witnessing that behavior. I know, and my dad's had people say stuff to him about, his accent or his lack of command of the English language. But I've never heard stories of them in high school. I'm not sure on my mom's side. I'm sure she's probably got some stories. My dad was just super athletic. And so
the privilege of sports.
The privilege of sports got him into the cool kids club. And so if anybody is listening, yes, stereotypical Cuban, he was an amazing baseball player. started on the varsity team all 4 years of high school as the catcher. He did not know how to play football at all. Never seen really a football, but he could run really fast. They taught him how to catch it. And then during high school, he played both offense and defense. Like, here's what we want you to do. We want you to run really fast. We want you to catch this ball. And then when you play defense, we want you to hit people. And my dad was like, right on, I got this. So I think my dad's high school experience was probably very different than my mom's. Plus, my mom finished up high school here. She started off high school in Spain.
Right.
So, and she still has friends there that are her age, that were school age, the same age, and all of that. So
she's had multiple cultural experiences
right,
in her
yeah.
life, where language might be a common thread, but actually the cultural experience is really different.
Right.
So what made you decide when you were 43? What made you decide that it was finally time to go to Cuba?
Well, I mean, there's always the fear because it was illegal for Americans to go. Now, there was easy ways to do it. You fly to Mexico, you go to the Bahamas, and then you go from there without a passport and put yourself at risk. And my dad, I think it's okay to say my dad had done that a couple of times to help out our family with needs in Cuba, which was even riskier for him because he has originally a Cuban passport, and so the government still sees him as a Cuban citizen. And so that's a little hairy. I was born here, so I'm a U.S. citizen. But with the Obama administration backing off on the travel restrictions and a little bit of a thaw on U.S.-Cuban relations during President Obama's administration, the opportunity came up through an organization. I work at a church, and at the time was still working with students, an organization that I had traveled with to Haiti, and the doors had opened. They said, hey, we're putting trips together for Cuba. And I was like, let's do it. And so that was pretty much the reasoning behind it. I was like, now there's no excuse for me not to go. Like it's time for me to go. And how awesome would it be to take students and some families that traveled with us to go experience this and see that. And not only that, but it was obviously there's a connection there in the community of faith for us in our context. So that's how that decision was made. I wish I could tell you that it was like this big, long, drawn out decision, but you've come to know me. Like, did you say adventure? Let's go.
Absolutely. So obviously, I mean, I can't imagine, but I'm going to ask you what sorts of things went through your mind as you were preparing to go, because so much of the stories that are told about Cuba, there are these individual, minute, single kind of facets of a story. So,
right.
As you kind of mentioned, your father was, going back every so often. There's this familial connection and wanting to help your family members who are still, suffering, if that's the best word, but suffering under a regime that creates some poverty and some need. Then there's the romanticized travel story, right, of a Cuba that is somewhat lost in time due to various trade embargoes, where every car is held together with pieces of duct tape and wire,
right.
And then there's the story of rum and the story of cigar rolling and the idea of these commodities that are somewhat precious and unique to this microcosm, and then there's the political scenario. So what's going through your mind as you prepare to go to Cuba?
Oh, wow. Honestly, the first thing was there was fear. I was super nervous because of the stories. Even though I knew some of those people put themselves in that situation for lying or being dishonest in their travel to Cuba, which is what got them in trouble with the government in the first place on the
and
Cuban
you mean
side.
The Cuban government.
Yeah. Like, at least in the American government, I know I'm going to have representation. I'm going to have some rights,
Yeah.
Traveling to Cuba. And at that point, the U.S. Embassy was open now. So, I mean, like, things had really thought out. So I wasn't like, thought I was going to get arrested at the airport, but there was some, like, it's just the unknown, right? I'd never been to a communist country before. Like, that's a new one. And so there were those things. And then there was just the, like, what's it going to be like to finally see this place that in my mind is this, I don't know, this place, I don't even know the right word. You hear about this place your entire life, right? It's like reading, let's see, like a C.S. Lewis children's story or something. This wonderful land that you've heard about. I mean, it's got its negatives, obviously, but you've heard about all the beauty of Cuba and the cars and the architecture, obviously the culture, and then you throw family into that you've never seen face to face, never been able to touch or hug or all of those things. So, and you've never even really seen the island. I think before the first time I traveled to Cuba, we were on a flight that flew over Cuba, and that's the only time I've ever seen it. And it just looked like a big green island, right? You just fly over and you continue on over the Caribbean. So there was just all of this emotion stirring that really didn't bubble up, and I didn't really even begin to start processing or deal with it until the day I traveled to Cuba, like right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what happens on that day?
So we fly down and we make our connection down in Fort Lauderdale, and then we take off. And as soon as we take off, it's like 90 miles, right, from Key West. So
I mean, you basically take off, go
up, and
come down.
Exactly. That's the flight. So I remember taking off, and I just got super excited. And then we flew off of the edge of Florida. I'm sitting at a window seat, like watching the whole thing. And as soon as we fly off the edge of Florida, Wi-Fi gets cut on the plane, right? Because no longer over American airspace once you're out a certain number of miles. So then I was like, okay, all right, this is different. And so we're flying in, and then the pilot comes on and says, hey, there's a massive storm over Cuba, so we're going to make a big looping circle and dive down through the clouds on a different approach. Just want to give it, just basically let everybody know, like, it's going to be kind of an aggressive turn. Don't freak out on us. And so we go in, and then we're in the middle of a storm. Like, you can't see anything but white out the windows. And at some points it's so dense. I'm sitting right on the wing disappears. Like, that's how dense the clouds are. Which was unnerving because you always want to see a wing on a plane. And so I just remember I'd never experienced that before. I've flown a lot. And we dip down below the clouds, and all of a sudden it's like the ground comes rushing up at the plane. And I just sat there just amazed, just mouth agape. Like, I was just, and I remember one of my coworkers, Paul, reached over and like grabbed my arm, and he goes, "You okay?" And that was all it took. And then it's like waterworks, right? Like, I'm like crying on the plane. Like, I don't know what's going on. But even then, like right there, I was like, this place is, this is amazing. Like, that's when the emotions all hit. And then, the next thing I remember most is as soon as they opened the door of the plane, it's like almost immediately I could smell Cuba. It was the weirdest thing for me. I've never experienced anything like that. I've traveled a lot of places, but it just hit me so hard. And then walking outside into the sun, down the stairs out of the plane onto the tarmac, it was just like, wow, I'm here. Like,
did it feel like a homecoming of sorts?
Absolutely. But in the weirdest way, because you're like, I've been here before, but you've never really been there before. It was like, okay, what's going on? Because I know I haven't been here before, but this feels so right.
I had the same experience. And we haven't, I don't know if we've talked about this, but the first time that I went to Scotland and driving over, which is where both my mother and father have family roots there. And we were actually driving intentionally to go visit the small town that my mother's family had come from, which didn't happen to be too far from where my father's family came from. Anyway, that's another story. But but driving over the hill, I was all of a sudden just hit with this wave of emotion and this absolute sense of, I had exactly what you're saying. I have been in this place before, even though I'd never been there before,
right?
But feeling absolutely at home and overwhelmed with the sense of just so many emotions that it would be hard to pull them all out and identify each individual
Right.
one. And there are tears rolling down my cheeks, and I come over that little bend. I'm looking at this landscape of hills and pastures. I come over this little bend, and then we're right there in Dumbarton in the little village, and I realized, oh my goodness, like this feeling that I have is this sense of homecoming.
Yep.
Which I think made me more Scottish than I've ever been. Certainly since that experience, I've felt more Scottish.
Right.
I was always pretty Scottish before, but the so what happened after that for you? I mean, did you feel more Cuban? Having
Yeah,
been to
absolutely.
Cuba?
Yeah. It was like, we have this expression in the United States. I don't know if you use it in New Zealand, but it was like drinking from a fire hydrant. So
Yeah, but go on.
So, a fire hydrant, you crack that thing open. It's like high pressure, high volume of water. The firemen hook up their hoses to it to put out a house fire. So it was like cutting that on and then putting your face in it and trying to like drink all the water coming out. It was just overwhelming at every point. I remember, so that the people listening understand, I was there on a church related trip. So I have yet to make physical contact with my family. They know I'm coming. They're excited, but we hit the ground running with the group.
Because you're at work.
I'm at work, right?
This is a
So
work job.
we're getting everybody through customs. We're getting loaded on the bus. And then we start rolling. And then this is when the cool stuff starts happening. So we're on this bus, and I notice that this bus, the name on the bus is from a church. And so I ask our contact in Cuba, I go, is this bus really from this church, blah, blah, blah? And he goes, yeah, we're partners with them and whatever. Well, the church that the church bus I'm on is the church that my mom and grandparents, her parents, attended. Like, and this bus is old. Like, I'm talking, this is a 1950s bus. More than likely, my mom has sat on this bus. Like, it was mind blowing, right? Just right out of the gate. So we make our way to a city called Matanzas, which is on the northern coast, beautiful place. And that's where we're going to be for the week. Halfway through the week, my grandmother's side of the family, on my mom's side, they drive 3 hours from further on the island to come and meet me. So that's the first time I meet family. That was pretty emotional, although didn't know them that much, even through social media. So that was kind of a get to know you kind of cool. But obviously you have familial ties, so automatically you're already clicking in conversation and relationship. And so that happens. The next really pivotal moment was when the Cubans there, it was like, okay, this guy is Cuban. And one night we got into a conversation and they're like, can you stay and talk with us? And I was like, yeah, sure. And so I sent the rest of the group and all the adults back to their housing for the evening. And I stayed there for an additional 2 hours. And that's when the conversation got real. That's when they started sharing with me how much they're suffering and reality of life in Cuba. And that they don't know who they can talk in front of and who they can't, and who's going to share what and who's not. And that's when I was like, whoa, like it was a wake up call. Like, this has all been great, but there's people suffering here. Like, and we're talking about simple needs. We're talking about feminine hygiene products, vitamins. I mean,
the basics,
things that we take for granted every day. I mean, for them, it's a luxury item. Excuse me. So that was a pivotal moment on that first trip. And then meeting my family, my grandfather, his sister, my great aunt, for the first time. She has seen me grow up through pictures. And I remember she was able to get a phone call through near my high school graduation in 1992, which was almost impossible to communicate that directly. And I'd had one phone conversation with her in my life. And that was the most emotional moment, was going down into a neighborhood in Havana and seeing a group of people out on a balcony outside of their apartment, just waiting for the taxi to show up. And just the explosion of joy on everybody's face to see me. Right. I was lucky enough to have a friend with me who's a photographer who took a portrait of those moments and of those some of my favorite pictures I'll probably have for the rest of my life. Was seeing that, and that's really. And then when I got back is when the processing really started.
Yeah, so let's
happening
talk about
hardcore.
let's talk about the change. Let's talk about what changes for you. I mean, you've always been Cuban. You're
Right.
100% Cuban.
Right.
But at age 43, you go to Cuba,
Right.
and then you come home, and now, are you really Cuban? Because now you know what home looks like, and you know what's happening, and the people are real. Tell me about the processing. What did you learn out of it?
Well, I think what happened is I started like realizing what it meant to be Cuban. Because now I've been there. Like I've experienced it. I've seen it. I've smelled it. I've tasted it. Like all of my senses have been engaged. But I started to process back through my life here in the States. Right. And so if you obviously we're recording a podcast, people can't see me, but if you see me in person, you would not ever pick me out as being somebody that's Cuban. Like, I think you can vouch for this, right?
Let's talk about like what is the Cuban caricature?
Okay, well, the Cuban caricature is, and not to, I mean, I'm hesitant to say it because I don't want to degrade my Mexican brothers and sisters, but in the United States, if you speak Spanish, then you must somehow have a tie to Mexico. And if you speak Spanish, there's just a certain, like your skin should be brown. You should have dark hair. You should be shorter. Like there's all of these, it's the caricature that you can see in American cartoons and all, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
Well, and there's probably an accent to it also.
Yeah, there's an accent.
Right.
And so obviously I speak without an accent. And English is my dominant language now, as far as use. But that's just kind of the thing. So what happened is I started to process and I started to think about growing up. So yeah, my parents are Cuban, but then I don't know why this happened. I started to realize parts of my life or situations that I got stuck in my life where I chose to be white American, right? So there's all these conversations, obviously, that have been going on for a long time, and I've always heard the term white privilege, and I've always I've recognized that, but what I didn't realize until I came back from or being in Cuba and then coming back is because of my appearance, I'm able to pick what culture I'm a part of, right? Because of appearance and language. So when I go to Cuba, they still see, like, because my parents are Cuban, I get a pass. But they'll be like, yeah, you speak Spanish with a slight English accent, which I don't take that as an offense at all. I mean, that's life, right? That's been my life. I've been here in the States now my entire life. So there's that. But I've just started realizing when I got back of all of these times where how easy it is for me to flip culture. And then just a further understanding of the value, not trying to put a positive spin on it, but a reality and the ease of white privilege, where I can just flip between cultures. And it happens all the time. I was at lunch 2 weeks ago with somebody here in our community, and we met at one of my favorite restaurants here close to us. And he is, American dude. So the server comes up and she's, broken English, trying to take his order. And she comes to me and I flipped to Spanish and she did a double take. She goes, "Oh, you speak Spanish?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm Cuban. My parents are from Cuba." And they're like, "Oh, okay. Yeah. You sound a little bit Cuban." So being able to flip that on in just even a slight situation like that. Right. Or going into, a situation in public where just everybody assumes you're just another white American dude.
Because you're tall.
Right.
You've got dark hair, but you know, you're not overly, you don't have a super dark complexion.
Right.
Right? You don't look traditionally Latin.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't have that Latin look. Right.
So are there examples where you're conscious now, historically or otherwise, where you have chosen the path of that white privilege? Because I think what's interesting about that is I think the common conversation nowadays, and at least we're talking about white privilege, but we're also talking about it largely in the context of not being African American.
Right.
Right?
Right.
As opposed to actually there's a world of immigrants here in the United States,
Right.
much as there are back in New Zealand and in many other countries, but we've kind of got these very kind of categorized and almost hierarchical descending order of,
Yeah.
of immigration.
Yeah.
The Mexican piece, the Cuban piece, the African American piece, there's a pecking order of sorts, which sounds terrible to say.
No, absolutely. And I think you could put that next to a graph of pigment color and they would match.
Probably.
Right? So I have a friend here who's from Germany, has only been here a couple of years. Obviously speaks with a heavy German accent, but his appearance is, Anglo. So everybody's cool with that. And I've had him around people that if his skin was any other pigment than white, they would have an issue, right? Or there are some things that they've said or posted that would be like, oh, I hope he hasn't seen my Facebook wall,
Right.
And so that really is the reality of it all. It really comes down to I hate to be simplistic, but it really is skin color in America. And that's been magnified even more after being in Cuba and coming back and starting to process how easy it was for me. If my skin, if I looked more like my family in Cuba, because my grandfather was super fair skinned, white, and I got his complexion. My brother was lucky enough to look like a Latin lover model type, So he got all my dad's athletic ability. He got it all. So,
hey, you got the flavor palette, man.
Yeah, I do. I do have the flavor. Thank you so much. Yes. And the body to go with it. So, but I just started realizing, like, all throughout my life, I went to a private school in the south side of Atlanta for a while that was predominantly African American students, but predominantly white teachers. And looking back at that, I can remember certain situations, whether on the playground or on the sports field or wherever, where I had a slight advantage of how I was treated because of the color of my skin by the people that were there. So, and then I had a little buddy who was Cuban, but he looked Latin. He looked like a Latino kid, and he was treated differently than I was. Looking back, I never realized that. I don't know if I really consciously, I'm sure I noticed like people got it, but it never dawned on me that it was because of the color of my skin. And there's plenty of situations where I've been around people and then they find out, oh, he's Cuban? Crap. Because of things they've said about me. That they don't make that connection at all. And so, unfortunately, I've learned some things about people in my life that I wish I wouldn't have learned because I thought they were awesome people. And then they either make the disconnect on my last name or something happen. That's even happened before where people that know that I'm Cuban say something around me and they're like, I need to apologize.
Right.
Because they see me and they forget this guy is Cuban. So
how has that changed, or what are you thinking about in terms of how it changes the way you live or practice or go to work or raise your kids in terms of, do you find yourself in a place now of wanting to dismantle the white privilege or work around it? Or is it just something that you're aware of and therefore trying to still navigate around?
So, well, yeah, now I'm like super aware of it. Like it's always there. As far as dismantling it, I mean, I'd love to dismantle white privilege, right? It'd be
Well,
great.
would you? Because life may not be so great,
Right.
if you did.
Yeah.
That's the tension, right?
No, that is the tension. And I'm involved in different organizations where that's a topic, is like, how do we move past white privilege in our country? And it's, some people say like that's impossible to never happen. And you can take that route if you want. That's not the way that I'm wired. Mm-hmm. I'm always wired to, there can always be progression made. And what's my role going to be in that? Right. And so that's where I do. And like my kids, I love the fact that, they have a healthy appreciation of diversity, both racially and gender diversity. Like they want to see everyone represented at a table, when they're involved in something. And when not everyone is represented, they have a hard time really fully engaging. And I love that about my kids.
Yeah.
Like I like that they've gotten to that point in their lives, and they're not afraid to like, point out and go, "Hey Dad, did you notice?" Like, and they point it out. So that's really great to see in your kids that, we talk about, we want our kids to be that way, and to see your kids engaging other cultures and people of other religions, but still being secure in who they are, right? There's nothing wrong that they have pale skin, but they're also aware of the fact of the advantages that they have because of that color of their skin.
Right.
Right. And
which awareness, I guess, is it's the opposite of ignorance, and
Right.
it's the starting place of at least being able to be conscious, and hopefully to be conscientious in the way that you live. And I mean, that's something that in my life, because I'm the only real marker of my otherness when I'm in a culture like the United States,
Right.
is my accent. I open my mouth and then it becomes clear,
But everybody wants to listen.
Well, some people. Once they get past the cute accent and they realize the provocative things I'm trying to say,
Right.
they tend to tune out. But I become conscious of wanting to at least live conscientiously within the privilege of having a skin color that allows me to fit in more easily,
Right.
within social structures that I would really rather tear down and rebuild and recreate.
Right.
And what I'm trying to figure out is the right pace of change, like how quickly can we tear something down, whilst also trying to build something different.
Exactly.
And I think that applies across the board for whether it's racial privilege, whether it's gender diversity, all of that stuff. We've got to be conscious of, we can't tear it all down without having a different structure or a different way of being in place to step into, to actually
Right.
live into that new way of being. Because I'm, become increasingly convinced that you can't just shoehorn the new into the old.
Right.
But what do you hope for? So you mentioned that you're heading off to Cuba again in just a few days, and you're taking your wife and your kids with you.
Yeah.
What are your hopes for them?
Well, I mean, the cool thing about my wife, Lisa, is when we were dating, and we were high school sweethearts. And so when we were dating even young, she just found Cuban culture fascinating. And for anybody that's listening that's Latino in any way, shape, or form, they know that there is never going to be a woman good enough for any Latin mother's son, like ever. So Lisa was smart enough to like jump in the kitchen with her, start learning Spanish. She learned how to cook the dishes my mom cooks. And just sitting down and having conversations with my mom and my grandparents, big winner. And so she was quick. I mean, she quickly won them over.
And that is the Diaz dating strategy.
That's the Diaz dating strategy. So I have a 21-year-old son. Anyways. No, but so it is kind of funny because that's the dating strategy in our family now. And my wife's not even Cuban. But for her to go and see where my family's from, I'm excited for her, and for her to meet people there, and the fact that she can have a conversation with them. Like, how awesome is that? And then obviously for my kids, it's the same deal. Like, this is where your great grandparents came from. This is where your grandparents came from. Like, this is this side of your family. This is it. We're jumping into the deep end.
Yeah.
Right. On this trip. Like me, for the first 42 and a half years of my life, you were swimming around in the shallow end, playing around in Cuban culture. Now we're about to like dive in all the way down into the deep end. And really experience it. And so for them to see the reality of Cuba, but also the beauty of Cuba, to hear the stories straight from my family, to see the places where their great-grandfather, my grandfather, who just passed away this last September, to see the places that he worked and served in the neighborhoods he was in, and the church that he was at, and all of those things, like just tapping into the past, tapping into history, and actually stepping into it and experiencing it in the way that I did.
Well, because it's a history that's still alive. It's a history that's actually very much present day, which is amazing. What was it like, do you think, for your parents to have you go to Cuba and kind of re-engage or reawaken this extra layer of Cubanness within you?
No, I think they're fine with it. My mom is always hesitant. My grandmother has zero desire for myself and Lisa and our kids to go back. She thinks we're crazy
because of the
just
the
that
political
long-standing
stuff.
tension. Yeah. That's those wounds are it's like they haven't really ever completely healed. And I don't think I can tell somebody like get over it. I didn't experience it. I heard how horrific it was. So I get it. And that's trauma that might never heal. It's something you deal with. But I also do see the reality where we don't see eye to eye on certain things, like the embargo. Like, I get why the U.S. made a trade embargo, basically an embargo on everything Cuba related, like not offering Cuba any services and not accepting any in return, in an attempt to undermine the government and the revolution that had occurred under Castro. I get it, but in going back, in walking all the streets of Matanzas and Havana, I've realized, okay, I understand we made that decision as a country and a political decision, and the fear of communism that existed in the world at that point, as it was advancing all over the world. That's a reality. But the reality also is that the Cuban people are suffering because of they can't establish trade with anybody. And then you look up at trade statistics and feed, stats on trade with Vietnam and trade with China, and all the same human rights violations are going on in those countries. Right. Again, in our family, it's the faith community. Christianity is huge. There were roundups of pastors in China just a few weeks ago, right? We're upset about that, but you go down to your local store and 90% of the things you pick up are made in China. And we're supporting that government and we're supporting that economy, and we don't have a problem with that as Cubans, but for some reason we don't want to do that for our own people. And that's the tough part for me. That's where I really live in the tension.
Yeah.
Right. Because everybody that's from my parents' generation on back that lived through the revolution, they're like, heck no, keep the embargo in place. And then you have first generation American Cubans like me who are saying, doesn't make sense anymore. Like, why should our families suffer in Cuba over politics? Like, let's end the embargo and let's figure out another way to work with the Cuban government to make sure that the human rights violations are not taking place.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then you can get, like, some people are going to hear this, I'm going to get in trouble, but let's not turn a blind eye and think that the U.S. is not involved in human rights violations.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're not going to go into the discussion on that. That's like a whole nother episode. But that's just the reality. Like, I started processing these things. I'm like, the America that I grew up on is not as clean cut as you're taught in school.
Right.
And the history, like, there's a lot of history that I've learned in as I've gone back to grad school in religion studies about Southern Christianity and its culture during the civil rights movement that is very unsettling. And being in Atlanta and then learning about the history of what went on just around our city and in our state of Georgia, it's horrific, right? So now to me, it's like there's this double standard. Like, why do we care so much about human rights violations in Cuba and we're not dealing about anything about it here, really? We've never been vocal. And then at the same time, we're fine to buy products from other countries that are communists. And we know about the human rights violations over there too, right? So there's this whole balancing act. And so that's created some interesting dialogue between some family members and myself.
Yeah.
You know,
which I think is the challenge, probably the most simple but also true way of describing the challenge that we live in today's context, where knowledge is everywhere and it's not hard to learn more than you knew before about actually how the world works. Is that question of, now that we know what we know, how now shall we live? Right. Not how shall we live because we've got the blinders on and we're able to, exist quite happily without being conscious of our white privilege, without having to deal with some of those tough questions. But actually, now that we know what we know, how now do we live? How do we live in that tension? How do we figure out the things that we can do in our immediate environment? How do we figure out the things that we take a stand on? Because I think in an episode with Richie Hardcore just last week, we had that conversation about, navigating how to have conversations about these difficult things is almost as difficult and confronting as the knowledge itself when you first wrestle with it. Because you can't have an experience like what you're talking about, going home to Cuba for the first time, becoming even more Cuban by setting your feet on the soil and being embraced by family members you'd never got to see face to face before. It can't not change you.
Right.
And so once it changes you at that very deep heart, soul, spirit, mind level,
right,
it has to then work its way out somehow in your life.
Yeah, and it's like that with anybody that you meet in life. Any group of people, ethnic, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, when you see somebody that's not like you, that makes you uncomfortable, it's easy to kind of have this weird disconnect from them as a fellow human being. But then once you come face to face with them and you enter into a healthy dialogue and relationship, it changes you. And then it's like you said, you have to do something, has to be done. You can't just pretend like that never happened, because that would be easy. I could come back here, completely ignore the Cubans that are reaching out to me on Facebook and text messages and WhatsApp or whatever, however they're trying to communicate with me. It's easy for me to shut that off, never go back to Cuba, and never have to deal with it again. Right? That's an easy one, and we can do that with people in our daily lives. But it's that whole idea of we have a mutual friend, Andrew Marin. The whole idea of living in the tension. Like, that's where I want to be now.
Right.
I think that's where it's propelled me. Like, before I knew something needed to be done, but now I want to live in that tension of, this is what I knew before and this is what I know now. So how do I live between these two worlds where, like you said, we deconstruct what needs to be deconstructed, but at the same time, like, build something in its place, not just level something because it's bad. As bad as it can be, we need to replace it with something, and it needs to happen at the same time.
May you travel well to Cuba next week, my friend.
Thank you.
Go have fun building some new things and eating some good food.
I will. I will. It'll be more fun eating the good food with my family, who typically can't eat the food. So to be able to provide for them is going to be that's my favorite part.
Yeah.
Just to see them sit around a big table, which they don't get to do as often, to eat to their heart's content and laugh and tell jokes and share stories. And that's going to be the magic of the trip for sure.
I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Tash, and it's time for the credits. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Transformationist. Please subscribe, rate, and review this episode wherever you listen to it, and share it with a friend. Visit thetransformationist.org for links to the resources mentioned in this episode and to subscribe to our email updates. You can also share your transformation story with us there, and I would love to hear from you. As always, this episode is produced by Michael Yoder at Truthwork Media. Music is by Hans Van Vliet. For more about me and the transformation work I do, check out the website. This show is proudly made possible by Solar Feeder Consulting.